Hi everyone, I am honored to introduce our guest speaker for the customer experience session at the Human Advantage Conference. Stéphane Marcel, Chief Growth Officer at BVA Group and one of the group champions regarding customer experience, and myself will be speaking with Professor Dilip Soman. Dilip is a world leader in behavioral science, currently Canada Research Chair in Behavioral Science and Economics at the Rotman School of Management at the University of Toronto. He served as the Director of the Behavioral Economics in Action Research Center, called BEAR, at Rotman. His research into behavioral economics has a particular focus on consumer well-being, marketing, and policy. Dilip is the author of a wonderful bestseller book, The Last Mile, published in 2015, I think. I have loved this book. He also teaches a massive open online course called BE 101X, Behavioral Economics in Action, on EDX. I have followed. I think I was one of the first in 2013. So I am very happy to be graduated from this MOOC. So a lot of things, but in the last 2 years, you have been very, very productive. You have edited 2 new books, The Behaviorally Informed Organization with Catherine Young, I think it was in 2021, and Behavioral Science in the Wild just this year with Nina Mazar, so in 2022. And it's not all, you have just released the second edition of Managing Customer Value, co-authored with Sarah. So that's it, Marandi, which will be at the heart of our conversation today. So I am very proud and very honored to have you on board, sharing your insight. Dilip, a big thank you for being with us today.
Thank you,
Welcome,
Eric.
Dilip.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here. So thank you so very much for inviting me.
First of all, a big thank you. We are very honored, and it is great to have you with us today, Dilip. And first of all, we all know that behavioral science can be applied for a lot of topics and in many directions. From the beginning of the Human Advantage Conference, we've seen the power of behavioral science to promote and improve sustainability, employee engagement, diversity and inclusion, and also innovation. So, Dilip, personally, why do you think the behavioral science perspective is specifically helpful regarding the customer value and experience?
Great question. Let me begin by giving some sort of personal historical context. So I'm not a behavioral scientist first. I'm a marketing person first. So I finished my engineering degree, started working on the shop floor, and then I saw an ad on the shop floor for a job doing sales and service for earth-moving machines. So I applied for that. I still, many years later, have no idea why they picked me. But that sales job was my first foray into marketing. I spent a little bit of time in advertising after that. And so when I came into behavioral science, the big ideas, the big questions I had were really customer value type of questions. And I do also want to pick up on something Eric said earlier in terms of when he introduced me. He talked about the fact that I'm interested in consumer welfare more than anything else. And one of my own personal dissatisfactions with the field when, back in the 1980s and 1990s when I was sort of in sales and advertising was it was a very transaction-oriented field. It was about trying to get people to buy things they didn't perhaps need, right? And everybody talked about value, but there was no good conceptual definition. So that's just by way of background, sort of the way I think about applying behavioral science to the field of customer value, customer experience. So to answer the question in terms of how does it actually apply, I'll say a couple of things. So I think one of the things that I definitely think behavioral science lets us do is to better understand what drives customer value. And in the absence of that, we're always going to rely on sort of our mental models. We also know from behavioral science that our mental models are usually not typical of our customers. We know there's an empathy gap. We know that as people become more senior, they tend to lose touch with what's happening on the ground. So, quick example, suppose I went to a bunch of managers who are in the transportation business and I said, look, let's think about a train service. Let's say it's an European train service, it's an overnight train. If I give people the option between a train journey that takes 5 hours and costs X euros versus a train journey that costs 8 hours and costs a higher amount, which one would they prefer, right? And most people would laugh at me and said, that's a ridiculous question. I mean, obviously people will take the cheaper and faster one, right? It turns out that's not the case. And it's not the case because people want to sleep on this train, right? So a 5-hour train doesn't give you enough time to sleep. So especially if you're traveling on business, I mean, you don't want to sleep for 4 hours and then get up wherever your destination is. So I think those are the kinds of insights that really understanding the behavioral science, I think, lets us do. I mean, we can think about the importance of pricing, the importance of delays. I mean, a lot of people will talk about waiting time as a negative. I always see that as an opportunity. Eric is probably familiar with some work we did early on with the province of Ontario on organ donations. We catch people when they're waiting to renew their driver's license. That's when they have bandwidth. So I think we really need to think about sort of, taking those pre-established, preconceived notions of what value is. And I think behavioral science lets us do that. So that's one. I think behavioral science also lets us rethink things that we've been doing repetitively without much thought over the past several years. And I'll give you a classic example of segmentation, right? This is the first thing we teach people, segmentation. And so I have a article coming out with a student, Kellen Kwan, where we make the point that segmentation relies on the idea that people are different from each other. Now, we know that, right? But we also know from behavioral science that not only are people different from each other, they're also different from themselves, right? So Dilip on the weekend does things very differently from Dilip on a weekday, or in the summer versus the winter or sunny day. We know this, right? And so why do we end up treating everybody that belongs to one cluster of people similarly, when in fact there could be some variation within that? And so we call for sort of a new way of essentially rethinking segmentation, make it behaviorally based as opposed to just kind of classifying people, classify behavior. So those are two examples that sort of highlight the way I think about behavioral science changing how we do the value customer value function. I think there's a couple of things. One is, I think the methods of behavioral science are really important for us. Like, we can learn a lot from what the behavioral scientists do to study situations to help us better understand what value we create for customers. And then second, the insights from the science are helpful. I always keep saying there are good hypotheses, good starting points that we should test further. But there's just so many insights from the science that we can apply to understanding what creates value. So perhaps a long answer to your short question, but that's the way I think about it.
No, not at all. Thank you very much, and it makes really sense. And also the fact that you repeat and re-put at the center the question of the context and the moment and everything which is linked to this. Another question, Dilip. As Eric has mentioned, you have just released the second edition of your book, Managing Customer Value. Why have you decided to write a totally new edition? And what have you learned from the last 10 years which has convinced you to do so?
That's an easier question. So I will say that the first edition of the book came out in 2009. It was written in 2008. So as you can imagine, we started working on it late 2007. So if I just do a snapshot of late 2007 to now, iPhone had just been introduced back then. Tablets. The only tablet we knew back then were the things that medicine comes in. We didn't have tablet computers. We didn't, like, Netflix was still sending out like discs by mail at that point in time. We had never heard of the gig economy. So clearly the world had changed. And so you could sort of look at sort of these very visual indicators. But I think there were three other big things that are drivers for, I think, the way we have changed the way in which we do customer value functions. So obviously digital and social was huge. Again, back then there was hardly anything. Again, Twitter had just been launched. And so we hadn't learned about the power of social media. We hadn't learned about the role that communities could play. Influencers were still in the physical world, and essentially it was all about just getting an endorsement as opposed to an influence. So I think that's changed the way we think about going to market for sure. Behavioral science. I mean, the first edition of Nudge had not come out when we started working on this book, right? And so now we have a long literature in that field. People understand behavior change a lot better. We have a vocabulary, and all of that was missing in the first edition of the book. I mean, I don't think the word nudge showed up in the first edition of the book, right? So that, and then the data and machine learning, right? So one of the things, going back to the point I made earlier about segmentation, machine learning now lets us create segments that are unique to a particular purchasing occasion, a particular transaction, right? And we couldn't do that. So I think this article that I spoke about on segmentation couldn't have even been written 15 years ago, because it's all very fine to say, well, let's base it on real segments, let's base it on real behavior, but we couldn't, and I think now we can. So I think capabilities have changed immensely. The marketplace has become a lot more crowded, and back in the days when thinking about financial services, like insurance companies just sold insurance products and banks just had accounts, and now everybody does everything. So I think, with all of that going on as well, it's created a lot more potential for confusion, but at the same time, potential for businesses to better understand how they can create value. So it's a completely different game. And I think it was really sort of at some point in time, reading the old version of the book and say, well, hang on, none of this is actually the world right now. And I think both Sarah and I kept pushing it back. And then the pandemic happened and we were all sitting at home for a period of time. And I picked up the phone and I said to Sarah, well, why don't we redo this? And initially we thought it'd just be like a question of updating some chapters. And then very quickly we realized we just had to rewrite the whole thing. So that's how that came about. But yeah, as you can see, it's a completely different world in a short 12 or 13 years.
Thank you. What perhaps remains an important topic on a point of view, and a personal point of view, is the fact that an organization should hold the individual's hand and walk them through a value chain, one stage at a time. Can you explain this a bit more? And more generally, what are the key insights from your book about the best way to manage customer value?
Okay, so I think now you're getting into the heart of sort of the way we think about the problem. So I'm going to hold up the book again. On the cover, you see ladders and people climbing ladders. And we use the ladder as a metaphor for how to grow customer value over time. So you never climb a ladder by jumping from the bottom to the top. You go it one step at a time. And I think that's the point we're trying to make. And that essentially means when we think about any customer activity, any customer outputs that we have in mind, is I think we have to be very deliberate about the pathway the customer should take to get to that point. And not everybody should get to the same stage in the ladder, right? Some people, it doesn't make sense to go to the top. And so that's why I keep pushing for the welfare idea. For some customers, it may make no sense to be your most loyal customer for whatever reason, right? And so I think we need to develop a way in which we can figure. But so the ladder becomes sort of an interesting metaphor. To operationalize a ladder, we think about customer activity and the notion of decomposing all of our metrics, including revenue. You've probably experienced this, but we've often worked with businesses that will kind of say, revenue's dropped, or benchmark with competition, our revenue hasn't grown. And we try to understand why that's the case. And we're appalled at the fact that a lot of these businesses don't maintain the data on basic drivers of revenue. So if I apply, for example, a metaphor of a retailer, what does a retailer do? I remember this conference where there was a CEO of a retailer who was speaking, and he said something like, retailing is really simple, right? And everybody was like, wow, like that can't be true. He says, oh, it's just four things. You bring people to your store, step one. Once they're there, you get them to buy something, step two. Step three, once they bought something, get them to buy something else. And then step four, have them come back again and again and do the same thing, right? So that kind of stayed with me in an interesting sort of way, which is, I said, well, okay, if revenues are declining, if we had data on each of these four components, we'd know what the problem is, right? So two firms with declining revenues, one might just be a traffic problem. People aren't coming to the store as much. The other one might just be a conversion rate problem, right? And so again, having that fine-grained metric in terms of what's working and what's not, I think allows you to then construct the ladder, because for every step in the ladder, then there's a metric, right? Is you can say, well, look, people are just not climbing the ladder to begin with. That's a traffic problem. Or they're not going to the first step. That's the conversion rate problem. Or they're not climbing fast enough, right? So I think that's one pillar that underlies sort of the way we think about customer value. The other pillar is something I've spoken about a lot also in some of my other work on behavioral science, the notion of heterogeneity, right? No two customers are alike. We just spoke about that. But we need to respect multiple paths, right? So the optimal ladder for Eric is going to be different from an optimal ladder for Dilip, different from an optimal ladder for Stefan. And I think we need to acknowledge that. We need to customize the way we design interventions. So think about the following simple thought experiment. At this point in time, it's a thought experiment, but it's not too far from being reality, which is, let's imagine, I know that different people like different layouts of a website. Okay, so Eric likes something to be organized by attribute. Perhaps, Stefan, you like something to be organized by options. But of course, as a web designer, I have to choose one or the other. What if I could somehow quickly figure out whether the customer that's arriving at my website right now is like Eric or like Stefan? Right? And if it is like Eric, I can then serve them a by attribute website. If it is like Stefan, I can serve them. Right? Now, so I keep saying this is a thought experiment, but it's actually potentially doable. If I can come up with quick ways of figuring out what are those observable features of Eric's behavior that define his or her preference for the kind of website, I can actually start customizing those interventions. So things like that, I think we need to be able to do, and we can do now with all of the new tools at our disposal. And then finally, the notion of just being able to actively, clearly conceptualize what we mean by value and how to measure it. I don't know about you, but I found value as like a big error term. Like everybody throws it around. Why do we do this if we don't have any other explanations? Or because it builds customer value, right? And then you ask people, what does that actually mean? And they don't have a good answer, right? So in the book, we make a distinction between different kinds of values, right? So economic versus experiential. Right? Economic value is something you can quantify a priori. I have a faster machine than my incumbent. I can quantify what that means for my customer, right? I have a slower train ride. That's an experience. It changes the nature of the day I have afterwards. Eventually, it will convert to economic value, because as people learn that the slower train makes for a better holiday or for a better working day the next day, they'll be willing to pay more. But right now, it's the experience and not the economics. So you can think about that dimension. You could think about where the value manifests itself, right? So think about like a faster machine, right? Who's going to make the decision to purchase? The purchasing manager. But the purchasing manager probably never sees the value. It's the person on the shop floor who sees the value when they need less labor or less materials or whatever that might be, right? So we think about that as a different type of value than value that is actually consistent or embedded in the consumption experience. So I think we need to be able to put a better framework on just trying to understand what we mean by value. How can behavioral science help us understand what that driver of value is? And then how can we measure that? And I think that's, to me, those three are the pillars. I mean, there's a lot of other stuff I could go into. But again, the notion of the ladder, the notion of heterogeneity, creating customized experiences, and then the ability to conceptualize and measure value, I think, are the three big pillars to answer your question.
Yeah, thank you. You've already you gave us some great example, and I think they will make a lot of sense for our audience. But is there some other example that you could share with us to illustrate how to successfully we can manage the client value and experience?
Sure. So I think, I mean, I'll give you a couple of stories. They are devoid of company names for obvious reasons, but I think they'll drive the point home. So let's imagine. Let's start off with sort of the notion of decomposing metrics and trying to move people up the value ladder. So let's imagine you have an ice cream vendor. In fact, that's an illustration in the book. And the ice cream vendor has three dimensions on which they could sort of earn revenue from their customers. There's the frequency, how often the person comes to get ice cream. There's the flavor. There are some high margin flavors, some low margin flavors. And then the volume, like do they buy 1 scoop or 2 scoops or 3 scoops, right? And so you can actually almost imagine a cube. Okay, at the bottom left of the cube, you've got somebody who comes very infrequently, buys the cheap stuff or the low margin stuff, and only buys 1 scoop at a time. Right now, you can move the person. Eventually, you want to move them to the top right, where they're buying a lot of scoops very frequently and of the expensive stuff. Right, but the question is, what's the right pathway? Right, and again, that's where I think the behavioral science and data science can inform us empirically by testing and figuring out what's the right way. The right way for Mr. X might be different from the right way for Ms. Y. But you can then also start doing things like incentivizing people appropriately. So suppose we have Mr. A who comes very frequently and buys like 3 or 4 scoops, but he's only buying vanilla. Right? There's an opportunity. Because we call it opportunity segmentation, right? The opportunity is if only Mr. A bought an expensive flavor, you could earn more revenue from them. Now, again, I'm not about to suggest that we do it if they don't want it, right? And that's why I keep saying it all depends on what the optimal step in the ladder is for those people. But I think those are the kinds of things that a systematic way of thinking through the ladder can help us understand. And then that's where behavioral science can contribute by showing here's the way in which we do research to understand it. Another quick example. Why do people who come to stores, let's say in retailing, planning not to buy anything, end up buying things? Well, they end up, it's not because they don't actually have a concrete plan. But we need to start mapping out what happens to people in the stores, right? They browse, they stop, if it's an apparel store, maybe they touch the clothes. And you can start, again, constructing a micro pathway as to what's going on at these different stages. And then finally, another quick example that I'll give is a cruise company trying to attract people that have never gone on cruises before. Now, here's a company that was offering these like 8-day long cruises, right? And I'm saying, people who have never cruised before, to get them to go on an 8-day cruise is a non-starter, right? It's like going from the bottom of the ladder to the top, right? And so we started constructing a ladder, right? And the company started doing interesting things. They would dock the ship in the harbor, but they would just let out the ship for corporate events. So people could just come to the ship, or weddings or other events, right? So it was just like a question of being familiar with the ship. Once they were on the ship, then they were like, oh, that's interesting, right? Then they introduced a 1-day cruise. It's just a thing that goes down the harbor, comes back, maybe you have a nice dinner, right? But that's how you get people used to it. And I think the research allowed the company to think about what those different steps in the ladder were. So I think those are some examples where we can actually take these basic ideas from the book and then start applying the methods of behavioral science to do the research that can then help us understand how and what those steps look like.
Thank you. Another question, which is really important for us, and especially for the kind of audience that we have with us around the Human Advantage event and conference, is the fact that we've understood that you also encourage leaders in organizations to think about the customer value function as something to be organized alongside activities that the firm would like the customers to engage in. Could you elaborate on this?
Yeah, so one of the things that Sarah and I learned that a lot of companies can't be ladder focused or value focused because of constraints set up by the structure. And let me give an example of what I mean by that. Right? Suppose we start looking at how marketing functions and organizations are organized. Like what does the org chart look like, right? It'll jump out that most of them are organized by what the marketer does as opposed to what we want the customer to do. There's a disconnect between your activity versus the output, right? So I do copywriting. I'm in the copywriting group, or you might do media, or somebody else might do research, right? So it's your classic. We don't see the 360 view. But suppose we were organized by we're all responsible for acquiring customers, right? Or we're all responsible for creating traffic. Right? So we have different groups that actually do that. So some of the companies that I work with are employing some sort of a matrix organization. So yeah, you can still have your copywriters and your research people and your pricing people, but let's overlay a matrix in terms of what your primary behavioral outcome responsibility is, right? If you're the acquisition people, you focus on that. Then it's a question of making sure you have the right metrics to maximize. But I think allowing people to see what the outcome of their work is going to be is an important ingredient, I think, of the value approach. So that's sort of what we were getting to. I think the other quick thing that I'll say is there is a big difference between what I call the marketing function and the marketing department. To Sarah and I, anything that creates customer value is the marketing function. So you could be in design and you're doing marketing, or you could be in sales and you're doing marketing, right? But most companies don't see it that way. It's like, we put a wall between marketing and everything else. And I think just the way that setup is it encourages the mentality of marketing waiting for the rest of the company to generate a product and then taking it out to the market, which, again, works for some, but perhaps there's a better way of doing it.
Thank you. We at the BVA family, we see a large part of what we do relating with evaluating and improving the customer experience. We will see some great examples during the upcoming roundtable with amazing organizations such as Lacoste, Le Française des Jeux, or Citeo. Our approaches are grounded in behavioral science and bolstered particularly by the Peak and End rule and the work conducted by the Ship and Dan Heath brothers, which we summarize with the acronym EPIC: Elevate, Pride, Insights, and Connection. Regarding the customer experience, what is, according to you, the key success?
So let me build on especially the Chip and Dan acronym that you spoke about, rather than amplify. So I think that stuff is great, right? But let me just focus on behavioral science for a moment. I think it is really important to think about behavioral science as a lens and not a tool. And I've heard a few people talk about this most recently. Mike Holsworth makes this point as well. Is we tend to think about behavioral science as offering a solution to problems. But I do think we need to think about it as a way of looking at problems, or in fact, even as a way of looking at non-problems, with a view to saying, can this be better? And I think that's an important piece, just to complement everything else you said, is that it's not just a tool. It's not just a solution pack. So I think that's one. I think the other thing is to recognize the centrality of situation, of context, of the heterogeneity. So because context is king in everything that we do, it is a mistake for us to stick to a winning formula all the time, because if the situation has changed, that formula is going to change. And therefore I think the ability to collect quick evidence from time to time becomes all the more important. And we've seen this in COVID, right? I mean, it was a different story when the world was stable and the same thing worked year after year. Now, that's not the case, right? And so it's kind of like driving through a tricky road with just a rear view mirror. if all you do is rely on past successes. So I think really the ability to quickly detect what's out there and react to it, I think those become key. So going beyond just the behavioral science, I think just putting in place the ability to collect data, quickly analyze it, and then react, I think would be the other key thing.
Maybe a last question before I hand back to Eric. What would your advice be for customer experience directors who would like start applying behavioral science?
So maybe I'll keep this at at a high level. I could give two. I think the first is to recognize that, in my opinion, every customer-related challenge is a behavioral challenge. Every problem is perhaps a behavioral problem, but not all solutions are behavioral. Right? So we always want to change people's behavior, but you don't have to do it through psychology. And as Eric knows, one of my mentors, Richard Thaler, always keeps saying, the only psychology you really need to know is if you want to get people to do something, make it easy or make it fun, right? So I guess what I'm trying to say is I think we really need to be clear and precise about what behaviors we want to change, but be open to the possibility that the way in which we change it might just be structural. It might not have to do with psychology stuff. So I think that's one. I think the second, I think, is the metaphor that I use in the last mile of thinking about behavior change as almost like a pipeline problem. How do I get water to flow through a pipeline? I need to create a pressure difference across the two ends of the pipeline. In psychology, that's motivation. And then I need to keep the pipes clean. In psychology, that's reducing sludge or improving nudge. And sometimes we focus so much on the nudge and not the motivation that we'll clean up the pipes, but water isn't flowing. Well, that's because nobody wants to flow through your pipe. So I think really keeping those two pieces in mind. I think Dan has a similar metaphor in one of his recent talks as well. But I think keeping that motivation and friction piece as two separate, distinct things that we both need to manage, I think that's key.
Thanks a lot, Dilip. I was sure this conversation will be very helpful, would be very helpful, and it is the case. So thanks a lot. Maybe a final question about the future. Regarding the challenge of customer value in general and customer experience specifically, what do you think the future looks like? Anything you are excited or hopeful about?
Yeah, so I think I'll respond to that as a scientist and say that I think the thing that really excites me is the promise that new technologies, new data, new analytics allow us. There were, like I say earlier, there were things we knew conceptually we had to do differently, but couldn't because we couldn't observe behavior. Now we can, right? So I think just like the excitement I sense is, being able to take tools like machine learning and then use them to help us better understand behaviors and fix them. We also used to emphasize, I remember in the early days of applied behavioral science, that RCTs are central. If you don't have an RCT, it's not really science. I think that's changing now. I think like with some of these new tools, there's things that we can do perhaps better than RCTs. So, but I think that's the excitement to me is we can get quicker data, faster data, actionable data sooner.
So thanks again a lot, Dilip. It has been a real pleasure to have you at the Human Advantage conference, and we are looking to speaking with you again later for a specific session. I will be part of this session with you for the infusing behavioral science within organization, which is, I think, one of your key topic and area of interest. So thanks again.
Thank you both. Thank you so very much.
A last point to our dear participants. Dear participants, stay tuned and logged in because we have a huge array of speakers and roundtables coming up to showcase real-life application of behavioral science that generates actual impact. We'll see you soon.